Public procurement is when the government buys stuff, when it buys office equipment, but also when it buys really big stuff, when it has a road built or a bridge built or a hospital built. It's a really big share of public spending. So in OECD countries, it's about 30% of public spending, but in lower income countries, it can be as much as 50% of public spending. And yet it's also really vulnerable to corruption. And I first realised this actually when I was doing research in the UK on local government. And I knew that corruption in public procurement was a big problem elsewhere as well. But it's really, really difficult to quantify that.
So when I got into public procurement research, anti-corruption in public procurement research, there were a lot of relatively high quality case studies, qualitative analysis, but barely any quantitative large-scale analysis. I met with Liz at a conference in Berlin where I presented some of my work, Liz presented some of her work, and it was immediately obvious that we have shared interest, and so she was very much in the theoretical, conceptual and qualitative aspect of it. I was very much looking at the quantitative bits. So actually when we started to discuss, it was a sort of a great discovery for both of us to see how our research complement each other.
Every year, governments spend up to 65% of their national budget through public procurement. And it is the means through which governments deliver goods and services to the public. Now, the problem was that public procurement, as everyone knows, is affected by lack of transparency, inefficiency, and lack of accountability and integrity. So our partnership with Elizabeth's group worked very well. We started by discussing the issues of the current practices and challenges. And then we worked on this process of how we're going to work together. What are the key indicators that we need to measure to address the corruption and integrity issues?
Let me give you an example. If you want to put up, to construct Jinja Kampala Highway Express, you have to think of the design. How will it look like? Where will it pass? What will be the size of this road? How many layers do I have to use? There are so many things you have to think of when you're designing before you even start building that road. So if I'm a crafty designer, and we have cases where we have design and build. If I'm a crafty designer, I can design something which I know I will not implement. But when you are budgeting, you budget for it. And the buyer will never know they're not going to implement that. The easiest example, if you are constructing this room, you see this room? It has pillars. When you are constructing a room, it has pillars. It has beams. In those beams, you put the iron bars. When I'm designing, I can design and say I'm going to use 25 millimeter iron bars, 20 of them. So when it goes to the PDU procurement officer, he will buy the 25 millimeter iron bars, 8 of them. But if the designer knew that 16 millimeter will work, he will never buy the 25 because it's design and build, under design and build. So you can see, you end up blaming the procurement officer, but when the designer knew what that was. So the corruption is, the integrity issues are very complex in the procurement process. And that's the challenge we have, that we still lack that.
So I first went to see the PPDA when I was on a trip in Uganda, I think in 2018, and met Edwin and Doreen then, and they already were doing actually some useful stuff. Again, they were collecting pretty good procurement data, and they were already thinking about this analytics and had been working with a couple of people on that. But then what was also really great is we had Gilbert at the Africa Freedom of Information Centre, and they were doing really cutting edge work in terms of bringing this data analytics in. So that partnership between government and civil society worked really well there. And I think it's extremely important actually in all of these situations to make sure that you've got both partners, ideally also some private sector actors because they're interested in a competitive procurement market as well. So the more stakeholders you get involved, the more they're pushing for reform and the more they're holding each other to account.
In Uganda, we conducted a mapping of the government procurement portal on the basis of open contracting data standards. We found that little data was being published, mainly on the planning stage, but not much on tendering, award, and implementation of contracts. Also, we found that the formats in which data was being published could not be used because it was essentially PDFs. So then Uganda became the first country to publish data in open contracting data standards. And then now the focus was on using this data. What is in this data? And that is how we met with the Government Transparency Initiative and started working with Elizabeth.
Yeah, when Elizabeth and Missy had, at conception stage, they had this idea, they interacted with us on how we would want it to work, whether it was a feasible thing or even welcome. The whole idea was very welcome to us because these were concerns that we were getting from our different players who wanted to go on the system and could easily get certain information. The concerns was it was not very easy to get the data that's on the GPP. You had to go and click somewhere, mine somewhere, maybe go back in. So it wasn't in a format that was necessarily very readable, understood by, let me say, your lay person or a civil society organization. The project then became very important because it made that information available in a format that could easily be understood.
So we deliberately wanted to build portals in places where there is quite a bit of corruption, but also good enough data infrastructure, good enough governance infrastructure so that someone would use our insights, our tools. So that was a sort of hard ask because, of course, data and transparency tends to be the best in places where you don't find that much corruption. So finding places where you have both good enough data and good enough reception from the government, civil society side was pretty hard, considering that we wanted to go for places with quite a bit of systemic and high-level corruption. So the hardest part of this process acquiring the data is to understand what's on the source, because procurement rules are complicated, they are followed in this way or that way by different public entities. So really making sense of the data is the hardest part. And once we understand how the data is published, what it means, we can put it in a standard structure which is predefined. And that standard structure is the same for every country where we work in.
Initially, we don't get into the depth and the rigor that the academics, of course, require of data and being able to defend the data that is on the system. So this system, therefore, that was the first challenge, that they had a very high standard of like the data. Before we even had that conversation, they had seen certain data that we had produced, and they had one or two questions about some of the data, and whereas we could explain it, they felt we needed to do certain things on the system to improve it so that it is self-explainable, rather than you having to speak to somebody who will explain to you what this number actually means. And that's why that dashboard becomes very important, because it should, the data or the information from the system should speak for itself, because you're not always there to speak for it.
When you go on the government procurement portal, yes, data is there, but you are not able to see whether there are red flags for corruption or not. You are not able to see conditions in the market. Is there competition or it is not there? So our tool with Elizabeth's group was able to provide this, to analyze conditions of the market, levels of disclosure, to say there is lack of competition or it is not enough. This strong research with academic institutions helped, to point where exactly is the issue and what is the issue. And this is the information that advocates like AFIC need to make compelling and evidential advocacy with government agencies.
I think the key challenge in this field is that this is a very complex field, both legally and technically. So you build big dams or a large bridge. And in addition, you have a process which is heavily regulated. So helping people to understand what's going on, look across a large number of processes, look at the profile of an organization, that's where our added value is. What we do is we create performance indicators, risk indicators, which help you have a quick overview of what's going on. Like what about this municipal administration? Is it doing better or worse than similar municipalities in this province, right? So for that, we create a set of validated, scientifically tested risk indicators, which we know are associated with corrupt behavior. So we allow users, with the help of data analytics, performance indicators, risk indicators, to quickly have an overview of the performance of an organization, benchmarking, looking at the whole market. So we are there to help you make sense of this.
What happens is a government will publish a lot of data about the public procurement process, and then using this methodology we can identify these different red flags which show us where there's a corruption risk. And that means that we can look across a whole country's procurement data, we can look at how it changes over time, and we can spot these patterns of corruption risk indicators.
For accountability institutions like us, we use this data to see what are the red flags for corruption, what are the issues on transparency, and then be able to provide feedback. Now, government developed a portal and published the data, but then we needed tools to be able to analyze this data more effectively, to come up with comparing findings, to inform us what is going right, what is not going right, what could go well.
So if you have good and clear information, it becomes much easier for you to monitor compliance. But it also helps us in policy reviews to see what is working, what is not working. Without the data, we'd be flying blind.
Public sector procurement definitely involves a lot of money. And as you're aware, almost about 60% of the national budget goes through public sector procurement. So it's a huge area, it's a great area for integrity issues. But the reality is that integrity issues can take place at any of the given point in the procurement cycle. So, and I think one of the reasons why we have failed to fight corruption is people concentrate on one area in the cycle.
Many people attach corruption to me giving you money, but corruption can be at every stage. So this instant software can help you be able to track those corruption tendencies. So in the sense that you get a very huge data, Ministry of Health has a lot of data, but they were interested in the one of procurement. So they picked the whole data of Ministry of Health. They filtered out that particular part they wanted, but it was still huge. They went ahead and continued to pick out, okay, we wanted procurement of some material. Then we realized that it was difficult to trace that there was corruption. So what they do, the government calls people to bid, like they are in the procurement process. Very many people will try to bid their things. But then there is this one particular person who keeps on winning. So when we tracked out and filtered out that data, we got to realize that those people who have been winning all the time, they are actually coming from one source. And so that is how the software was able to track that, oh, corruption at this stage was here because this particular person has been using the trick of changing. And to us, we will see that as if different people over years have been winning contracts, yet it's actually one particular person winning the same contracts that government wins.
Since 2015, our advocacy and engagement with the government of Uganda has been on the basis of the government procurement portal. Now, accountability starts with transparency. When there is no disclosure, it becomes difficult, to hold anyone accountable. So that has been a major basis of our advocacy. The basis of getting the information, which then we use and process for our advocacy and engagement.
The portals aim to have a wide range of users and use cases, if you like, but there are a few ones which we have seen in particularly interesting across a number of countries. If I work for a procuring entity where I want to buy a particular good or service, and I want to understand who are the players on the market, what are the usual prices paid, then I can start by clicking on market analysis, which gets me to the market analysis dashboard, where I can zoom in a particular sub-market or market I'm interested in. So let's select hotel and other and related services. Click there, you can select a relatively small sub-market, canteen and catering services. And once I get here, one can also look at the different procurement procedures used. In this case, negotiated procedures are typically the used. And what's becoming very interesting for the buyer, for the procuring entity, is that one can look at the different suppliers who are active on this market, either by the number of tenders or the volume of these contracts. But then if any of the suppliers are of particular interest, so we can have Grand Global Hotels Limited, and see what this supplier has been doing in a couple of years in terms of contract value. And quite importantly, for the years when this company was active, it was possible to look at the performance of the company compared to benchmark performance in that sector or in that particular region. And then benchmarking is quite useful, because if you are thinking about contracting a company, one thing you would want to know if it's doing better than the alternatives, other companies in that market. And again, you can look at all the contracts associated with this company so that you can trace the performance indicators, the overview the portal gives you, trace it back to the official publications, each and every publication.
If one uses the dashboard, Opentender dashboard, there's a lot of information that you can find there. Let me give an example. You can find information on the number of years the project is supposed to last. If the project was supposed to take 3 years, but you find the project is taking 5 years, then suddenly now you can see the gap. Why these extra years? What is the implication? Because the implication could be that actually government is even putting in more money. Why was that delay? Why was there that delay? So you can see that access to information.
The major difference, the major value addition is about integration. That you don't need to have first to visit about 20 portals. You could find what you need in one portal that seems to combine and link the very many. And for me, people are not interested in detail, because the detail brings the technicality. So when you look at the previous portals, yes, there is quite a lot of information, but the usability is about, it requires expertise. It requires too much expertise compared to this, which you don't need to be an IT specialist to be able to understand some of the information provided by this portal.
So if you have this information on the dashboard, it helps us to fast track some of the issue, what is going on, and identify some of the issues, and then begin engaging around that. So if this information is availed, it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge it, especially to the duty bearers, but also continuously to identify issues. If, for example, not all the information that you might be wanting in regards to the procurement cycle can be gotten. So we're able to raise it up. If we are identified, we're able to raise it up with the duty bearers, and then request them to perhaps up the game and make sure that all the necessary information is available.
We've been able to strengthen our relationship with the government because we shine the light on the areas that need improvement. And this is very critical because when you don't have a mirror to show you what is going right, you'll keep going, but maybe in a wrong direction. So we've been able to inform government, and we see, for example, competition has improved. It has moved from 1.47 to 3.1 tenders per bid. So there's more competition because there's better disclosure. There's also engagement by showing that here, there's no competition.
that government has very good laws and very good policies, and the challenge has been with the implementation. But now with the automation, then it becomes easier. Work becomes easier to implement. To implement these legal frameworks. It becomes easier. By click of a button, you can access information. By click of a button, you can do the monitoring. If you're an oversight agency, you can have access to any ministry's information. With this dashboard, even the market, the suppliers, the providers, development partners will have access with this kind of technology being put in use.
Quite often government has been taking leadership in developing these portals with minimal involvement of the consumers of this information, so that at the end of the day they have a lot of hurdles trying to define and to make people understand what they have designed. Yet the consumers, for me, should be very important in providing the necessary input in the initial design of these portals. That is number one. Number two is about the infrastructure, the necessary infrastructure to enable these portals work. If you look at our energy coverage here in Uganda, we still have challenges in terms of accessing the power to power the gadgets that we use to access these platforms electronically.
We need to do a lot of training, create more awareness, and then we hope that probably at a certain time, but of course we need to do it faster because time is not on our side. But we think it can work for us if we train them more and more. With the different engagements we've had, we have seen them at least change. They just keep lacking maybe the necessary support sometimes, like internet or something.
First of all, the law is very clear. It gives an opportunity to Ugandans to participate in the fight against corruption. So they have to appreciate, on the side of the public, they have to understand that they have a right, they have a role to fight corruption. On the side of government, equally, they should know that whatever they are doing in the interest of Ugandans, should be on the interest of Uganda. How are Ugandans benefiting from those offices that they occupy and the policies that they pass? So there should be commitment in both sides.
As CSOs, we need to lobby for reforms, policy reforms, and most probably if we can do that with the engagements Transparency has tried, at least we engage with a number of stakeholders, and we believe at some point some reforms might have to change.
As activists, we always want to run very fast and get government agencies act on our issues and recommendations. But sometimes, we are not clear. That's why comparing evidence is very, very important. Which agencies are not disclosing information and you want them to disclose? What information is not being disclosed? Because in the case of Uganda, for example, 92% of the agencies that were registered on the government procurement portal were disclosing procurement plans. But then only 18% were disclosing tendering information. So with this clear information, it helps you to target on the specific action that you want this ministry, department, or agency to undertake.
The purpose for such data being available to the public is not just for PPDA or the technocrats, but also the public out there, civil society, members of the public, to just have this understanding of what's going on with procurement, and then can use that information for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes put pressure on their political leaders to make amendments to the existing rules, but also know what's going on in their communities. And with this kind of dashboards, it then makes it a lot easily understood by somebody who doesn't have to be necessarily very technical in these areas.
We are scaling up advocacy in Nigeria, in Ghana, Malawi, and Kenya for increased and improved disclosure based on open contracting data standards. Once this is done, we are going to use our dashboard, to analyze and give them better feedback on areas that need improvement for them to provide better services for citizens and obtain value for money in public procurement.
Uganda for us is a special place because on the one hand it's an unlikely champion for open data. There are very few similar cases in the wider region, and we have came across a number of problems which come from lack of funding for government IT infrastructure, lack of support for some public organizations, but still a core coalition of civil society as well as governmental actors who want to push change. So we really were stuck about how dedicated they are and how every time we come into a problem, we jointly looked for problems of data publication, data format, the lack of stability of some of the IT infrastructure in government. So we jointly looked for solutions, and that was really amazing, and that's why we have a portal in Uganda.
So public procurement is about delivering better services. If we can solve the corruption, then we get better services to the people, and that's really important. But it's important not just for the quality of the services, but also because then people trust their government more. And actually what we really want is better functioning, more efficient relationships between the state and the public, so that the state is delivering for the public and in the public interest.
One of the things that we see is a gap between practitioners and researchers. Researchers and academics generate a lot of knowledge that is important for policy. Activists have the reach, the experience, and expertise in advocating, but without comparing information, this advocacy is undermined. There is really need for civil society to understand what is their need, what is the gap, what is it that our advocacy is lacking, which then the evidence from the researchers can blend in. And this is one of the critical areas working with Elizabeth and her group brought on the stage.
In summary, as a patriot or as a Ugandan who is patriotic, trying to fight corruption in this country, and if I have chance to access some of these tools that can help us break down corruption, then of course I have to be interested.